You've heard the name Robinson Crusoe, right? Of course you have. He's the ultimate castaway, the poster child for survival. But that famous novel? It's fiction. The real story, the one that sparked the whole legend, belongs to a man named Alexander Selkirk. And believe me, his true story is even wilder than the fiction.
So, let's get right to the biggest twist. We all have this image in our heads, don't we? A massive storm, a ship torn to pieces, a lone survivor washing up on a beach? But what if I told you that's not how it happened? What if the real Robinson Crusoe wasn't a victim of bad luck? What if he chose to be left on that deserted island? So, who was this guy? Well, let's meet him. Alexander Selkirk, born way back in 1676 in Scotland. He was the son of a shoemaker, but he was a handful. A hot-headed, rebellious young man who was always, and I mean always, picking fights and getting into trouble. Eventually, his bad behavior caught up with him, and he was hauled before the church court. Facing punishment with really no future at home, Selkirk did what a lot of restless young men did back then. He bolted. He ran away to sea. You know, it was the perfect escape, and frankly, a world where a fiery temper could actually be a good thing.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's the early 1700s. The War of Spanish Succession is raging, which basically means the oceans have turned into a massive global free-for-all. For a guy like Selkirk, who thrives on conflict, this wasn't chaos. Oh no, this was opportunity knocking. He became a privateer. And you might be asking, what on earth is that? Well, think of it as legalized piracy. Seriously, governments would hand out these licenses, called letters of marque, to private ships, giving them the green light to attack and rob enemy vessels. It was the perfect job for someone like Alexander Selkirk. So by 1703, a 27-year-old Selkirk lands a spot on a major expedition. It's led by the famous explorer and privateer William Dampier. Selkirk is made the sailing master on the second ship, the Cinque Ports. This was his big chance to make a name for himself and, more importantly, a fortune.
But that rebellious streak, it hadn't gone anywhere. After the ship stopped for some supplies, Selkirk became totally convinced that the hull was riddled with worms and was going to sink. He got into a furious argument with his captain, a guy named Thomas Stradling, basically screaming that the ship was a death trap. Stradling got fed up and gave him an ultimatum. Get on the ship or we leave you here. And this is the moment. This is the heart of the story. Alexander Selkirk made a choice. He was so dead certain that the ship was doomed that he decided being marooned on some random uninhabited island in the Pacific was actually the safer bet. He gambled his entire life on his own stubborn gut feeling.
So, they did it. They left him on one of the Juan Fernandez Islands. And what did he have to start his new life? His sea chest. Inside was a musket with a little bit of gunpowder, a hatchet, a knife, a kettle, his clothes, a Bible, and his navigation tools. Just imagine that, standing on a beach with just that stuff, watching the only ship for thousands of miles sail away.
Now, he almost immediately regretted it. The panic must have been overwhelming. But then came the craziest part. He was right. The Cinque Ports sailed on, and a short while later, it sank. Most of the crew drowned. The few who survived, including Captain Stradling, were captured by the Spanish and thrown in prison. Selkirk's defiant, insane gamble had actually saved his life.
But, okay, saving his life was just step one. Now he had to live it, all by himself. His reward for being right was to be thrown into a world of total, crushing isolation. For 4 years and 4 months. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's more than 1,500 days without hearing another human voice. The sheer mental fortitude that must have taken it's just staggering. So how in the world did he do it?
Well, the man was incredibly resourceful. First, he needed shelter, so he built himself 2 solid huts out of tree branches. For food, he hunted the wild goats on the island and got so good at it that he could literally run them down on foot. When his clothes eventually just rotted off his body, he used a nail to painstakingly sew new ones out of goatskin. And get this, when huge swarms of rats started raiding his food, he tamed the local wild cats, who became his personal bodyguards.
But surviving physically was only half the battle, right? The real war was going on inside his head, the fight against madness. To keep himself sane, he turned to that Bible they'd left him. He would read it out loud, he'd sing psalms, anything to just hear the sound of a voice, even if it was his own. It was his anchor to reality.
Then, on February 2nd, 1709, after 4 years and 4 months of complete solitude, he saw something on the horizon.
2 ships. He frantically lit a signal fire, just praying they weren't Spanish, who would probably kill him. This time, his luck held. They were English.
When the rescue party came ashore, they found this wild man. He was dressed head to toe in goat skins, and his English was so broken from disuse he could barely speak. But then, the most unbelievable coincidence happens. Someone on board the ship knew the story. It was William Dampier, the very same captain who had led the expedition that left him there in the first place. Dampier vouched for him, and just like that, Selkirk was saved.
And Selkirk wasn't just some helpless victim they rescued. His time on the island had made him an incredible hunter and an amazing seaman. He was immediately made second mate, and when the expedition finally got back to England in 1711, his cut of the profits was a whopping 800 pounds.
Now, 800 pounds might not sound like a life-changing amount to us, but to put that in perspective, that's worth about 200,000 pounds today. In the blink of an eye, Alexander Selkirk went from a man with absolutely nothing to a very, very wealthy gentleman.
But here's the final tragic twist in his story. After surviving everything the island could throw at him, he discovered he couldn't survive society. The noise, the crowds, the social rules, it was all too much for him. The man who had conquered solitude was now completely lost in a crowd.
Of course, a story this incredible was bound to get out. The captain who rescued him wrote about it in a book, and Selkirk's tale became an absolute sensation. It captured everyone's imagination, and eventually it inspired a writer named Daniel Defoe to create a fictional version of his ordeal, and that's how the legend of Robinson Crusoe was born.
After about 6 years of trying and failing to fit back into civilized life, Selkirk just gave up. In 1717, he went back to the only world that ever truly made sense to him, the sea. He joined the Royal Navy, and just 4 years later, while serving off the coast of Africa, he caught yellow fever and died. He was buried at sea.
Years later, his friends would say that Selkirk often confessed something really telling. He said he was never happier than when he was on his island, when he wasn't worth a single penny. He actually longed for the peace and the quiet he had there. The fame, the money, it all meant nothing to him.
And that leaves us with this one big, lingering question, doesn't it? We look at his story and we call it a story of survival and rescue. But for Alexander Selkirk, the real man, was returning to our world the rescue he had dreamed of for all those years? Or did he just end up trading one kind of island for another, much more complicated prison?